There's a strange kind of silence that speaks louder than words, a quiet distance that somehow feels full of tension. And if you've ever found yourself wondering why she hasn't reached out, yet you can't shake the feeling that you're still on her mind, because sometimes the loudest desire isn't expressed through messages or calls, but through the thoughts that linger long after the conversation ends and the night begins to settle in. Everything changes, because what happens when the world goes quiet often reveals what people try hardest to hide. You see, attraction is rarely as simple as presence or absence. It lives in the space between actions and restraint, in the moments where someone chooses not to act, even when every part of them feels pulled toward you. And that's the paradox that confuses so many men. The idea that a woman can feel deeply connected, even intensely curious or emotionally drawn, and still not make the first move, still not send that message, still not give you the reassurance you're waiting for, and instead, she holds it in, lets it build, lets it evolve into something more complex than simple attraction. Because for her, reaching out is not always just about desire. It's about timing, emotional safety, perception, and sometimes even power, not in a manipulative sense, but in a deeply instinctive one, where she is trying to understand what you mean to her without risking too much too soon. And while you're sitting there, interpreting silence as disinterest, she might be replaying your last conversation in her mind, analyzing your tone, your words, your energy, wondering if you feel the same intensity. She's trying so hard to keep under control. And this is where most men get it wrong. They assume that communication equals interest and silence equals absence. But real intimacy doesn't always follow such predictable patterns, especially in the early stages when emotions are still forming and both people are trying to protect themselves from being too vulnerable too quickly. And for a woman, especially one who feels something deeper than surface-level attraction, pulling back can actually be a way of leaning in emotionally, because she wants to feel that connection grow naturally, not forced, not rushed, and certainly not one-sided. So she waits, she observes, she lets you take the lead, not because she lacks interest, but because she wants to see if your actions match the feeling she senses beneath the surface. And while she's doing that, something else begins to happen, something far more powerful than constant communication. She begins to think about you in quiet moments, in the spaces between her daily routine, when she's alone with her thoughts and there's nothing to distract her from the feeling you've created inside her. That's where real attraction starts to take shape, not in the noise of endless texting, but in the silence where imagination takes over, where curiosity turns into emotional tension, and where the absence of contact doesn't weaken the connection, but intensifies it, because now you're not just someone she talks to, you're someone she thinks about, someone who lingers in her mind without needing to be present. And that's a completely different level of impact. And if you understand this, if you truly grasp what's happening beneath the surface, you stop chasing immediate validation and start focusing on the deeper psychological dynamic at play, because what you're really dealing with isn't a lack of interest, it's unexpressed desire mixed with emotional caution, and that combination can be incredibly powerful if handled correctly, but it can also collapse if you misread it and respond from a place of insecurity or impatience. Because the moment you start overcompensating, sending too many messages, trying to force a response, you disrupt the natural rhythm she's building internally. You replace curiosity with pressure, and suddenly, The space that was once filled with thoughts about you becomes occupied by the need to create distance, not because her feelings disappeared, but because the dynamic shifted from intrigue to expectation. And expectation is where attraction often begins to fade if it's not balanced properly. What you have to understand is that emotional tension thrives in uncertainty, in the subtle push and pull that keeps both people engaged without overwhelming either side. And when she's not reaching out but still thinking about you, you're in a position of quiet influence, a position where your presence is felt without being forced. And that's where true intimacy begins to develop, not just physical or superficial, but psychological and emotional, because now you exist in her inner world, not just her external. And this is where patience becomes your greatest advantage, because while time passes, her thoughts don't just stay the same, they evolve, they deepen, they become more emotionally charged, especially if the connection you created initially had authenticity, confidence, and a sense of mystery that she couldn't fully figure out, because the human mind is naturally drawn to what it doesn't completely understand. And when you become that unresolved thought, that lingering question in her mind, you create a kind of attraction that doesn't rely on constant attention. It feeds itself through curiosity and emotional engagement. But here's the part that most people never talk about: the internal conflict she experiences during this phase. Because while part of her wants to reach out, to break the silence and reconnect, another part of her holds back, analyzing whether doing so would shift the balance, whether it would make her feel too exposed, too available, or too invested before she's sure of your intentions. And this internal dialogue is what keeps her in that state of quiet contemplation, where she's emotionally engaged but externally distant. And if you misinterpret that distance, you risk losing the depth that's quietly building beneath the surface. Because attraction isn't just about what's said, it's about what's felt. And what's felt often grows strongest in the absence of constant interaction, where the mind fills in the gaps with imagination, with desire, with questions that only you can answer. And the more she thinks about those unanswered questions, the more emotionally invested she becomes without even realizing it. So instead of focusing on why she hasn't reached out, you start asking a different question. What is she feeling in the moments when she's not talking to you? What impression did you leave that continues to exist even in your absence? Because that's the real measure of attraction, not how often someone contacts you, but how often they think about you when they don't have to. And when you understand that shift, everything changes. The way you communicate, the way you carry yourself, the way you interpret silence, it all becomes more grounded, more confident, and more aligned with the deeper reality of human connection. What makes this dynamic even more intense is the way her thoughts begin to connect with her emotions on a deeper level, because the more she thinks about you without acting on it, the more those thoughts start to carry weight. They stop being casual and begin to feel meaningful, almost personal, as if there's something unresolved that keeps pulling her back into that mental space where you exist. And this is where desire quietly matures into something more layered, something that blends curiosity with emotional attachment in a way that doesn't need constant interaction to survive. She might find herself remembering small details about you, the way you spoke, the confidence in your tone, the subtle energy you carried that felt different from others. And these details don't fade easily because they weren't forced or overexposed. They were just enough to leave an impression without giving everything away. And that's exactly why they stay with her, because Mystery has a way of anchoring itself in the mind far longer than familiarity ever could. And as these thoughts repeat, they begin to form patterns, and those patterns slowly shape how she feels about you, even if she hasn't fully admitted it to herself yet, because emotional awareness doesn't always arrive instantly. Sometimes it builds quietly in the background until it becomes impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, from your perspective, it may feel like nothing is happening, like the silence is a sign that the connection has stalled or disappeared, but in reality, something is unfolding in a way that is far less visible but far more impactful. Because when someone processes their feelings internally rather than externally, the result tends to be stronger, more intentional, and more. This is why reacting impulsively can disrupt everything. Because the moment you try to force clarity too early, you interrupt a process that actually benefits from time and space. And instead of allowing her feelings to develop naturally, you shift the focus toward pressure and expectation, which creates resistance rather than attraction. And this is where emotional intelligence becomes essential. Understanding that not every connection needs constant reinforcement, not every silence needs to be filled, and not every moment of distance is a sign of disinterest. It's a sign that something is being felt more deeply than words can easily express. She may be testing the emotional waters in her own way, not by playing games, but by observing how you exist without her immediate validation, whether you remain grounded, confident, and self-assured, or whether you become reactive, uncertain, and overly eager for reassurance, because these reactions tell her more about you than any conversation ever could. And without even realizing it, she's building a perception of who you are based on how you handle this phase, because attraction isn't just about chemistry, it's about stability, emotional presence, and the ability to create a sense of safety without needing constant control over the outcome. So when she notices that you're not chasing, not overextending, not trying to fill every gap with noise, it actually strengthens her internal attraction, because it shows that your interest is real, but not desperate, present, but not dependent. And that balance is incredibly rare, which makes it even more compelling. At the same time, her own hesitation continues to evolve, because the longer she thinks about you, the more she begins to question why she feels this way, what it means, and whether she should act on it. And this internal questioning can create a subtle tension that grows stronger with time, a tension that isn't uncomfortable, but rather intriguing, like a story that hasn't reached its conclusion yet. And this is where emotional anticipation begins to take hold, because now it's not just about you, it's about the possibility of what could happen if she reaches out, if she breaks the silence, if she allows the connection to move forward. And that anticipation can be incredibly powerful because it's driven by her own curiosity rather than external pressure. But here's the critical point. Anticipation only remains attractive as long as it feels voluntary, as long as she feels like she's choosing to engage rather than being pulled into something she's not ready for. And this is why maintaining your composure is so important, because your energy sets the tone for how safe or pressured the interaction feels, even in your absence. If your last impression carried confidence, calmness, and a sense of grounded masculinity, then those qualities continue to echo in her mind, reinforcing the attraction even when you're not there. But if your energy was inconsistent or overly intense, those same patterns can create doubt instead of desire, and doubt is what slows everything down. So what you're really influencing isn't just her decision to reach out, it's the emotional narrative she's building around you, the story she's telling herself about who you are and how you make her feel. And that story becomes the foundation for whether she moves closer or pulls away. And as time passes, something subtle but important begins to happen. The absence of communication starts to create a contrast between how she feels when she is thinking about you and how she feels when she's not engaging with you directly. And if the thoughts are positive, engaging, and emotionally stimulating, then that contrast actually works in your favor because it makes her aware of what's missing when you're not present, and that awareness can naturally lead her to close the gap, to reach out, not because she feels obligated, but because she wants to reconnect with that feeling. And when that moment comes, it often feels effortless, almost spontaneous, like she's simply following a thought that has been building for a while, rather than making a calculated decision. And that's the kind of engagement that leads to deeper connection, because it's rooted in genuine emotion rather than external pressure or expectation. But until that moment happens, the most important thing you can do is stay aligned with the version of yourself that created that initial impact, because consistency in your energy is what keeps the attraction stable, even in silence. And the moment the entire dynamic can shift in ways that are difficult to recover. From. And this is where everything either comes together or quietly falls apart. Not because of anything dramatic on the surface, but because of the subtle decisions made beneath it, the internal shifts in perception, the way she finally interprets what she's been feeling all along, because after enough time has passed, and those thoughts about you have repeated themselves again and again, they stop feeling accidental and start feeling intentional. And that's the moment where she begins to accept that what she feels isn't just curiosity or temporary attraction. It's something that has stayed with her despite the distance, despite the silence, despite the lack of constant interaction. And when a feeling survives, it becomes far more real in her mind than something that needed continuous attention to exist. At this stage, she's no longer just thinking about you. She's evaluating what those thoughts mean, whether they reflect a genuine connection or simply an idea she's built around you. And this is where your earlier presence becomes incredibly important, because whatever impression you left is now being examined more deeply than ever before. And if that impression was grounded in authenticity, confidence, and emotional steadiness, then it holds up under that scrutiny. It continues to make sense to her. It feels consistent with the way she remembers you, and that consistency is what transforms attraction to trust, even before anything new has happened. But if there were signs of inconsistency, neediness, or forced intensity, those same memories begin to feel misaligned, and that misalignment creates hesitation. Because now she's not just wondering how you made her feel, she's questioning whether those feelings were based on something stable or something temporary. And this is why the quiet phase you've been in was never empty. It was shaping the outcome all along, building either clarity or confusion, depending on how you showed up before the silence began. And assuming you handled it well, assuming you allowed space without losing your sense of self, something very natural begins to unfold. She starts to feel a pull toward resolution, not because she feels pressured, but because unresolved emotions naturally seek closure. And in this case, that closure doesn't mean ending the connection. It means exploring it, understanding it, giving it a chance to exist in reality rather than just in her thoughts. So when she finally does reach out, and often she will, if the emotional tension has built in the right way, it won't feel forced or strategic. It will feel almost casual on the surface, but deeply intentional underneath, like a simple message that carries far more meaning than it appears, because behind that message is all the time she spent thinking about you, all the questions she asked herself, all the restraint she maintained until she felt ready to act. And this is where many men make a critical mistake. They treat that moment as the finish line instead of what it really is, the beginning of a deeper phase, because now the connection is moving from internal to external, from thought to interaction. And the way you respond in this moment determines whether the dynamic continues to grow or starts to lose the very tension that made it powerful in the first place. If you suddenly become overly available, overly eager, or emotionally overwhelming, you collapse the space that allowed her feelings to develop. You remove the balance that made the connection intriguing, and instead of deepening the attraction, you replace it with predictability. And predictability, while comfortable, rarely sustains desire on its own. But if you stay grounded, if you meet her energy without trying to control it, if you allow the interaction to unfold naturally without rushing it into certainty, then something much more meaningful begins to take shape, because now both of you are engaging from a place of genuine interest rather than insecurity or expectation, and that creates a foundation that can actually support deeper intimacy, not just physical, but emotional and psychological as well. Because real intimacy isn't built on constant contact or immediate validation. It's built on understanding, on timing, on the ability to let attraction breathe without suffocating it with urgency. And when both people feel that sense of space within the connection, they're able to show up more honestly, more fully, without the fear of losing themselves in the process. And what started as silence transforms into something much richer. Something that carries depth because it wasn't rushed, because it was allowed to develop in its own time, guided by genuine emotion rather than forced interaction. And this is the truth most people overlook, that someone not reaching out doesn't always mean they're moving on. Sometimes it means they're moving inward, processing, feeling, building a connection in a way that isn't immediately visible, but is incredibly real. And if you have the patience and awareness to recognize that, you stop reacting to surface-level signals and start understanding the deeper rhythm of human connection. You realize that attraction isn't just about presence. It's about impact, about what remains when you're not there, about how someone feels when they think of you without being prompted. And when you become that kind of presence in someone's life, you don't need to chase attention, you naturally draw it, because the connection exists beyond constant interaction. And in the end, what truly matters isn't whether she reached out first or how long it took. It's the quality of the connection that emerges when she does, the depth of the interaction, the authenticity of the emotions involved, because those are the elements that determine whether something lasts or fades. So instead of focusing on the silence, you learn to understand it, to respect it, to use it as a space where attraction can evolve rather than something that needs to be filled immediately. And in doing so, you position yourself not just as someone she talks to, but as someone she feels, someone who exists in her thoughts in a way that time and distance can't easily erase. And that is where true connection begins, not in constant communication, but in the quiet moments where someone realizes they can't stop thinking about you even when they try.